I didn't realize how quickly a life could flip until it happened in a place full of people who didn't know my name. One moment I was standing in a crowded European airport, replaying a family argument in my head. The next I was staring at a counter where my boarding pass should have been, my phone gone, my passport not in my hands, and my family already past security like I didn't exist. The argument had started over money, as it always did. I said no. Not now. Not again. I needed to breathe, to rebuild after my divorce, to stop being the emergency fund everyone dipped into whenever they felt like it. That single word changed everything. My parents' faces hardened instantly, that familiar mix of disappointment and control. My sister avoided my eyes. I didn't even notice the quiet coordination until it was too late. She had taken my phone earlier for photos. My mother had insisted on holding all the documents to keep things organized. When they collected their boarding passes, I was still arguing, still trying to explain that boundaries weren't betrayal. By the time I realized my return ticket was missing, they were already walking away. I stood there frozen, heart pounding, watching the backs of the people who raised me disappear into the crowd. When I rushed after them, security blocked me. No boarding pass, no access. I tried the help desk, voice tight but steady, explaining that there had to be a mistake. That my ticket had existed minutes ago. The agent's sympathy faded when I couldn't produce proof. Security stepped closer. I was told to leave the restricted area. That was when the weight hit me fully. I had nothing. No phone. No passport. No way to call for help. I had been abandoned on purpose. That was also when he appeared. He didn't rush. He didn't interrupt. He waited until the security officer turned away, then stepped close enough that only I could hear him. He looked expensive without trying, tailored suit, calm posture, eyes sharp like he'd already assessed the situation. "Pretend you're my wife," he murmured. "My driver is pulling up." Then, with a faint smile that sent a chill down my spine, he added, "Trust me. They'll regret this." I don't know what I saw in his face, certainty maybe, or the simple fact that he wasn't offering pity. In that moment, desperation overruled caution. I nodded once, slipped my hand into his, and followed him out before my fear could catch up with me. The limousine door closed behind us, sealing off the noise of the terminal. As the car pulled away, Paris lights streaking past the tinted windows, I finally let myself breathe. My hands were shaking. He didn't comment on it. He gave me space, staring ahead, like this was all perfectly normal. After a minute, he turned slightly. "I'm Marcus Hale," he said, voice low and even, American accent softened by years of travel. "I run a real estate investment group out of New York." "I'm Lena Alvarez," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I was 39 years old, recently divorced, and apparently bold enough to climb into a stranger's car because my family had erased me in an airport. He nodded once, acknowledging it without probing. "I saw how you handled yourself back there. You didn't panic. You tried to solve the problem." His eyes flicked to my clenched hands. "Most people don't." "I didn't have the luxury of falling apart," I said quietly. "Exactly," he replied. "That's why I intervened." He explained it plainly, no theatrics. In 2 weeks, he had a major charity gala in New York, not just a social event, but the final step before closing a development deal with conservative partners who valued appearances more than they admitted. He was a widower. The loss had been public. A rival inside his own company, his younger brother, had been using that grief to question his judgment, to suggest he wasn't stable enough to lead. A wife, even temporarily, would silence that narrative long enough to secure the deal. "You want me to play a role," I said. "I want someone real," he corrected. "Not an actress reading lines. Someone who can think under pressure." "And you decided that was me," I said, half incredulous. "You were resourceful," he repeated. "That matters." He laid out the terms before I could ask. A private jet back to the States that night. safe housing in Manhattan, $50,000, a new phone, and help uncovering what my family had actually planned. He didn't sugarcoat the risk. There would be confidentiality agreements, scrutiny, questions. He admitted his own vulnerability, recent decisions made while grieving that hadn't paid off. The internal challenge brewing against him. He needed time. I asked the only question that mattered. What protects me? He met my gaze without flinching. Legal contracts, full discretion, and final approval on what parts of your life become public. I weighed it all in seconds. Staying meant navigating foreign systems without documents. Going meant stepping into something calculated but controlled. For the first time in years, the choice was mine. Deal, I said. The jet was sleek, quiet, efficient. I slept despite myself, exhaustion pulling me under as soon as we lifted off. When we landed in New York at dawn, a discreet car took us straight into the city. His penthouse was high above the noise, glass and light and silence. A housekeeper showed me to a guest suite that felt more like a refuge than a room. Clean lines, soft sheets, a view of a city waking up below. I showered, changed, and stared at the new phone on the nightstand. No missed calls. No frantic messages. Just an empty screen waiting for me to decide who had access now. I called my cousin Sophia, the only person in my family who had ever listened without an agenda. She answered immediately, voice tight with worry. My parents had already started calling people, she said. Telling them I'd had a breakdown, that I was unstable after the divorce, that they were afraid I'd hurt myself or mismanage money. They're talking about protecting you, she added carefully. About your inheritance. The apartment your grandparents left you. My stomach dropped. That condo was the one thing that was mine outright. They stranded me, I said. They took my phone. My passport. I believe you, she said softly. But they're building a story. By the time I ended the call, anger had replaced shock. This wasn't emotional. It was strategic. I went downstairs and told Marcus everything. He listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly. They're laying groundwork for control, he said. In New York, it's hard but not impossible. We counter fast. Within hours, his attorney was involved. Papers drafted. Evaluation scheduled. I spent the rest of the day reading, learning, refusing to be passive again. That night, staring out at the city lights, something shifted. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was preparing. And somewhere between the airport in Paris and that quiet room above Manhattan, I realized something else. My family thought abandoning me would break me. They had no idea what it had actually done. The next morning didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like a reset button I hadn't known existed. I woke up in that guest suite with the city stretched out beneath the windows, sunlight cutting clean lines across the floor, and for a few seconds I forgot where I was. Then everything rushed back, the airport, the whisper, the deal, my parents' voices already rewriting the story of my life. I sat up slowly, grounding myself in the quiet. No one was banging on the door. No one was demanding explanations. That alone felt unfamiliar. Downstairs, the penthouse was already active. Marcus moved through the space with purpose, jacket off, sleeves rolled, papers spread across a sleek dining table that doubled as a war room. He looked up when I entered, not surprised, not patronizing. Coffee? He asked. I nodded, accepting the mug he slid across like this was a normal morning between partners. I told him about the call with my cousin, about the inheritance angle, about how my parents were framing concern as care. He listened carefully, then said something that stuck with me. Control rarely announces itself as greed. It shows up dressed as protection. His lawyer arrived not long after, a sharp woman with a calm, assessing gaze. She asked questions, not about my feelings, but about facts. Employment history. Financial records. Medical diagnoses. The difference mattered. By the time she left, there was a plan. Preemptive filings. Documentation. No waiting for my parents to move first. While all of that unfolded, the gala preparation began in earnest. I expected to be sidelined, kept ornamental, but Marcus didn't do that. He looped me into meetings, vendor calls, logistics reviews. At first I stayed quiet, listening, reading the room. Old instincts kicked in, the ones I'd built over years of managing chaos for other people. I noticed inefficiencies. Timelines that would bottleneck. Seating arrangements that would spark tension between investors who hated each other quietly. "Can I say something?" I asked during one meeting. Marcus nodded immediately. "Please." I spoke plainly, offering solutions without apology. The coordinator blinked, then adjusted her spreadsheet. By the end of the session, I was taking notes alongside her, not as a guest, but as part of the machine. When a sponsor hesitated, citing rumors about Marcus's stability, I drafted the response myself. It was firm without being defensive, confident without being arrogant. The sponsor increased their commitment an hour later. Marcus noticed. He didn't flatter me for it. He just started asking my opinion more often. Late one night, while reviewing budgets, he admitted something he hadn't shared publicly. "After my wife died, I made a decision I shouldn't have. Rushed a property deal. Ignored a red flag because I didn't want to sit with the quiet." He said it without self-pity. Just truth. "My brother uses that as proof I'm unfit." "Then don't deny it," I said. "Show what you did next. Recovery matters more than mistakes." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. "That's exactly what my board needs to hear." We rehearsed appearances, refining our story until it sounded lived in, not rehearsed. Not perfect. Real enough to withstand scrutiny. By the time the gala arrived, the role felt less like acting and more like collaboration. The night itself was flawless on the surface. Cameras. Smiles. Champagne. Underneath, tension moved like a current. A tabloid article dropped mid-event, resurrecting rumors about Marcus's judgment. I watched the ripple it caused, saw one key investor pull back, polite but distant. I didn't wait for permission. I crossed the room, introduced myself, spoke directly. I showed him numbers Marcus hadn't released yet, projections grounded in corrections already made. "This isn't denial," I said quietly. "It's course correction." He studied the screen, then looked up at me differently. The contract was signed before dessert. In the car afterward, Marcus exhaled like someone who'd been holding his breath for years. "That article will still fuel my brother's case," he said. "I need something stronger. Something undeniable." He looked at me, not romantically, not desperately. Strategically. "Marry me." On paper. 1 year. I didn't laugh. I didn't flinch. I asked about terms. Compensation. Exit clauses. Control over my image. Protection of my assets. He agreed to all of it without negotiation. At City Hall, we signed quietly. No vows. No witnesses beyond the required. When I folded the certificate into my bag, it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like armor. The guardianship filing came days later, exactly as Marcus had predicted. My parents cited old emails, cancelled appointments, emotional language from the worst months after my divorce. It looked convincing if you wanted it to. We responded with facts. Performance reviews. Financial records. Evaluations confirming I was fully competent. The contrast was stark. They flew in unannounced, demanding a meeting. I faced them alone, lawyer present but silent. They accused. I countered. They framed love as obligation. I named it for what it was. Control. When my father demanded I sign over management of the condo in exchange for dropping the case, something inside me went cold and clear. "No," I said. withdraw everything. Or I pursue this publicly. They didn't expect that. They left furious, dignity frayed. The judge dismissed their petition outright weeks later, noting the lack of evidence and the obvious financial motivation. No penalties, but the record remained. The silence afterward was loud. Friends distanced themselves from my parents. Invitations stopped. The leverage was gone. The marriage contract ended exactly as planned. Clean. Respectful. Marcus won his case too. His brother's challenge collapsed. We parted as allies, not lovers. I opened my own firm soon after, using contacts from the gala. The condo became my office. Light filled the space I finally owned, in every sense of the word. Standing by the window one evening, city humming below, I understood something I hadn't before. Betrayal doesn't always end you. Sometimes it clarifies you. Sometimes it forces you to choose yourself when no one else will. After the judge dismissed the petition, the world didn't suddenly become quiet. It became sharper. Clearer. Like background noise had dropped out and left only what mattered. I expected relief to wash over me, maybe even some sadness, but what settled instead was resolve. The kind that doesn't need applause. The kind that just moves forward. The temporary marriage did its job, but it didn't define me. What defined me was what came next. The condo that my grandparents had left me had always felt like a promise I wasn't allowed to open. Every time I thought about renovating it, about making it mine, someone in my family would remind me how lucky I was, how I shouldn't risk it, how assets like that needed oversight. Their oversight. Once the legal dust settled, I walked through it alone for the first time with a different mindset. Not as an inheritance I had to justify, but as a foundation I could build on. I turned the lower level into an office, clean lines, open space, glass walls that let light pour in. Upstairs stayed personal, calm, intentionally sparse. No clutter, no excess. I wanted every room to feel like a choice, not a compromise. When I registered my event planning firm, I did it under my own name. No family ties. No borrowed credibility. Just mine. The first contracts came from people who'd watched me work quietly during the gala. They didn't care about the tabloid stories or the drama. They cared that things ran smoothly, that problems disappeared before anyone noticed them. Corporate launches. Nonprofit fundraisers. Private events where discretion mattered more than glamour. I delivered every time. Word spread faster than I expected. At the same time, the echoes of my parents' actions kept resurfacing in small ways. Mutual acquaintances stopped returning their calls. Invitations they'd once hosted disappeared from their calendar. I heard bits through Sophia, who stayed neutral but honest. My parents insisted they'd been misunderstood. That they were victims of manipulation. That I'd been turned against them. The narrative shifted depending on who was listening. Angela sent an email months later. No accusations. No excuses. Just regret. She admitted she'd known something was wrong at the airport. That she'd stayed quiet because staying quiet had always been easier than challenging them. I read the message slowly, feeling the familiar pull to smooth things over, to make it okay for everyone. I didn't reply. Not because I hated her. But because responding would reopen a door I had deliberately closed. Healing doesn't always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like distance without drama. Marcus checked in occasionally, usually with a quick message or a question about a venue. Once, he asked if I'd help consult on a corporate retreat his company was planning. I agreed, professionally. We walked the property together, discussed flow, lighting, logistics. There was no awkwardness. No nostalgia. Just mutual respect between two people who had navigated chaos together and come out intact. "You're different now," he said once, watching me direct a setup crew. "I am," I replied. "So are you." That was enough. The real shift came the day I realized I wasn't bracing anymore. Not before phone calls. Not before meetings. Not before decisions. I wasn't waiting for permission or preparing for backlash. I trusted my own judgment fully for the first time in my life. That trust was quieter than fear, but far stronger. One evening, after a particularly successful event, I stood alone on the condo balcony, city lights stretching endlessly below. I thought about that moment in the airport, how close I'd been to breaking down, how convinced my family must have been that I'd crawl back once I had no options. They had miscalculated something fundamental. They assumed abandonment would make me compliant. Instead, it made me independent. I didn't lose my family that day. I lost the illusion that they were safe. And in its place, I gained something far more valuable. Autonomy. Clarity. The ability to choose who had access to my life. People talk about betrayal like it's a single moment, a clean cut. It isn't. It's a series of small realizations that pile up until you can't ignore them anymore. The healing isn't dramatic either. It's practical. It's boundaries. It's paperwork. It's silence where chaos used to be. I didn't rebuild to prove them wrong. I rebuilt because I finally understood that my worth was never something they got to define. Success changes the way people remember you. Not because you've changed the past, but because you no longer fit the version of you they were comfortable with. As my firm grew, I started noticing it everywhere. People who had once spoken over me now asked for my opinion. Contacts who had ignored my emails suddenly followed up quickly, polite, attentive. It wasn't validation I was chasing, but it was revealing. Respect, I learned, often follows leverage, not history. The business took on a rhythm that felt natural. Early mornings reviewing proposals. Site visits that turned into long walks through half-finished venues, imagining how light would fall once everything was complete. Late nights solving problems most people never realized had existed. I liked that part best, the invisible work. The quiet satisfaction of knowing chaos had been prevented, not just managed. The Hamptons became a regular destination again, this time on my own terms. Not hiding. Not escaping. Working. One of my largest events to date was scheduled at a waterfront property there, a multi-day gathering for executives who valued privacy as much as luxury. I handled every detail personally. Flow of guests. Security timing. Lighting that shifted with the sunset instead of fighting it. When the first evening ended perfectly, I stood back and watched from a distance, hands in my pockets, listening to the ocean beyond the terrace. For a moment, memory tried to intrude. My parents' voices. Old guilt. The idea that success somehow needed to be shared to be legitimate. I let it pass without engaging. Growth had taught me something simple. You can acknowledge where you came from without dragging it into where you're going. News from my family filtered in sporadically through people who meant well. My parents had sold their house sooner than planned. Angela had switched departments at work. There was talk of strain, of embarrassment they didn't quite name. None of it reached me directly. They never apologized. They never admitted intent. They just waited, I think, for time to soften things enough that I'd forget. I didn't. Not in a bitter way. In a grounded way. Forgetting would have required minimizing what they did, and I wasn't willing to rewrite reality for anyone's comfort. One afternoon, Sophia visited the condo. She walked through the office space slowly, smiling. "You did this," she said. Not impressed. Proud. That meant more to me than she knew. We sat with coffee near the windows, talking about ordinary things. Work. Travel. Life without crisis as the main topic. Before she left, she hesitated. "They still talk about you," she said gently. "Like you're going through a phase." I smiled faintly. Let them. That night, alone again, I reflected on how different strength felt compared to survival. Survival is reactive. It's bracing. Strength is quieter. It doesn't announce itself. It just holds. The firm crossed a milestone that year, its largest contract yet. Industry recognition followed. Nothing flashy, just steady acknowledgement. I hired a small team, people who worked with the same calm precision I valued. I paid them well. Trusted them fully. Leadership, I realized, wasn't about control. It was about clarity and respect. Everything my family had confused with authority. Occasionally, I thought about that whisper in the airport. The moment I let a stranger change the direction of my life. It wasn't fate. It was choice meeting opportunity. If I'd learned anything, it was this. You don't need saving. You need options. And the courage to take one when it appears. As the year drew to a close, I stood once more on the balcony, city lights reflecting off the glass behind me, ocean far away but remembered. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. No apologies. No reconciliation. No permission. Just forward movement. The strange thing about closure is that it rarely arrives with ceremony. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic message, no moment where everything clicked into place and stayed there forever. Closure came quietly, disguised as routine. As mornings where I woke up without dread. As decisions made without second-guessing how someone else might react. As the steady rhythm of a life that finally belonged to me. The firm didn't explode overnight. It didn't need to. It grew the way solid things do, consistently, predictably, with momentum built on trust. Clients came back. They referred others. They trusted me with events where failure wasn't an option. I became known not for theatrics, but for outcomes. For calm under pressure. For making complicated things feel seamless. That reputation followed me farther than I expected. International inquiries. Collaborations with people who valued discretion over ego. I said no more often than yes, choosing projects that aligned with how I wanted to live, not just what would look impressive. Freedom, I learned, wasn't about excess. It was about alignment. The condo no longer felt symbolic. It felt lived in. The office downstairs buzzed during the day, quieted in the evenings. Upstairs, my space reflected who I was now. No trophies. No reminders of past pain. Just light, order, and intention. Sometimes I stood in the doorway and thought about how close I'd come to losing it all, not because I was incapable, but because someone else wanted control. That realization never fully stopped stinging. But it stopped ruling me. Angela never wrote again. My parents never reached out directly. Through distant channels, I heard they still framed the story as concern taken too far, a misunderstanding fueled by outside influence. I let them keep that version. Arguing with it would have required stepping back into a role I'd outgrown. The daughter who explained herself. The one who tried to be understood. I didn't need to be understood anymore. Sophia remained. Quietly. Consistently. She never asked me to reconcile or forgive. She simply met me where I was. That, more than anything, confirmed I'd made the right choices. The people meant to stay don't demand you diminish yourself to keep them comfortable. One afternoon, after wrapping up a major waterfront event that had taken months to plan, I found myself alone on the terrace as guests. Drifted away. The ocean stretched out in front of me, steady and indifferent. The air was cool, the sky streaked with fading light. I thought about that woman in the airport, standing stunned while her family walked away without looking back. I barely recognized her now. She had believed loyalty meant endurance. That love meant compliance. That saying no made her difficult. She was wrong. What that day had really taught me was simple and brutal. Betrayal from strangers hurts. Betrayal from family reshapes you. It forces you to decide whether you'll keep shrinking to maintain access, or expand even if it costs you everything familiar. I chose expansion. Not out of anger. Out of necessity. Marcus and I crossed paths once more, briefly, at an industry conference. We exchanged a few words, easy and professional. He looked lighter. So did I. There was no lingering debt between us. No sense of unfinished business. We had been exactly what the other needed in a narrow window of time. Nothing more. Nothing less. As I left the venue that evening, I felt something settle fully into place. Gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it forced. For the reminder that independence isn't selfish. That protecting your peace isn't cruelty. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away without trying to fix what was never yours to carry. If you've ever been abandoned in a way that made you question your worth, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need their permission to build a good life. You don't need their validation to trust your judgment. You don't owe access to anyone who confuses love with control. Walking away isn't failure. Sometimes it's the first honest step toward freedom,